know that this is official. It's an informational meeting. It's being held for a presentation to be made by Land Beyond the Sea. Was it LBS Ecological? I'm sorry. And this is for our community forest management plan. Miguel
Yes, sir.
Arias, how are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well. How about yourself?
Good, good. So the board's here. There's a number of people online to listen to your presentation. And I guess we can go ahead and get started.
Okie doke. I will fire up the share screen and just get into it here, I believe. Okay. All righty. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. Here we are talking about the Village of Canton Urban Forestry Project, the Tree Risk Inventory and Community Forest Management Plan. So tonight is the public meeting. It's the 12th at 6 p.m. And here we are. Folks are in the village as well as via Zoom. So here's a presentation outline of what we're going to go over today. We'll start off with a little bit about LBS Ecological and Amro Forestry. We'll talk a little bit about the DEC program that funded the whole thing. We'll go over a little bit of background urban forestry information about Canton. We'll follow that with speaking about the risk inventory that we did and how we did that data collection. We'll talk about the iTree ecosystem analysis, forestry recommendations, and follow that up with some other recommendations that might not be planting or pruning or something like that, but certainly information that we want to share. We'll do a conclusion and then we'll have a little bit of time for a public input Q&A session. But like I said before, we get into the guts of the presentation, just a little brief slide about us. LBS Ecological is me mainly. I'm the owner, Miguel Barrios, and Amro Forestry is basically the executive VP is Artem Traeger. We worked on the project. We mainly do ecological planning and design, urban forest management, and also I guess what you describe as more of a traditional forest management. Like I said, I'm Miguel. I'm an ecological designer and I've accomplished numerous tree, forest, ecological surveys, different assessments and management plans. I have a bachelor's in natural resource management from Cornell University and a master's degree in landscape architecture from SUNY ESF. I'm also a certified arborist through ISA. Also a Natural Resource Conservation Service certified technical service provider for habitat planning. And Artem, who's here with me, is a certified forester. He's a PhD. He has his BS in environmental science. He's got a master's in applied ecology and a PhD in forest and natural resources management. Like I said, he's a certified forester. He's a certified arborist. He's also a commercial pesticide applicator in New York State DEC cooperating forester. He's also an NRCS technical service provider as well, and a Forest Service qualified timber cruiser, which, believe it or not, I am as well. The New York State DEC Urban and Community Forestry Program is the other half of all this. It's a partnership between the DEC forestry professionals, public and private individuals, and volunteer organizations. It supports communities in comprehensive planning, management, and education to create healthy urban and community forests, which in turn enhance the quality of life for residents. So the Village of Canton Risk Tree Inventory and Community Forest Management Plan, or CFMP, when you might be hearing that a few times tonight, are grant funded through this program. Michelle Higgins and Scott Moxham are working with us. Actually, it's not. It's sorry. Yeah, Steve Sherwood. Sorry, I had the wrong guy on there. Are working with us on this project from the DEC side of things. Sorry, Steve. I got a few of these going on. Okie doke. Now, before we get into the details about the urban forestry work that we did, it's important to note the vision statement that the group created for this project. So here's Canton's Community Forest vision statement. The vision is a community of people and their homes, stores, and other structures and spaces within a forest of trees. So really think about that. The forest is made up of the trees, street trees, trees on the roads and highways, in our parks and other public spaces, and around our buildings and structures. This forest is diverse and beautiful, and it provides many benefits to the people who live, work, or visit here. It also protects the land and water, purifies the air, and provides habitat for birds and other wildlife. And the underlying purpose of the CFMP, the Community Forest Management Plan, will be to guide our decision-making toward the best practices for conservation and maintenance of existing trees, and planting new trees that will enhance this forest and the community. And this slide really just for reference to Canton's location and makeup. You can see Canton kind of situated between the universities here. You can see the grass, river, and the built environment of the village and its environs. Really, this map shows the streets and the parks to a small extent where the urban forest exists and grows. And all along these streets are street trees, and then in the parks, and then in the river park, there's many public trees to enjoy as well.
So we're going to switch off a little bit. This is Artem speaking. Now that we know a bit about the program and Canton's vision and location, let's take a look at a bit of the urban forest, which is the main topic of the presentation. Our job was to conduct a risk tree inventory and create a community forest management plan for the village. In order to do this, we first needed to look at and make use of the current tree inventory, which the village of Canton, associated with local arborist Matt Randy, prepared an inventory of the village's urban forest in 2016 and 2019, or throughout that time frame. Canton's urban forest is made up of all the public trees in the village, including both street trees and the park trees. The data from the previous inventory informs the community management plan, forest management plan. This tree data was used to determine the urban forest composition, ecosystem services that the trees provide, and potential pests and pathogens of the urban forest. So we looked at the data from the previous inventory, and the first thing that we did was an iTree ecosystem analysis on the data. So the data from that inventory was analyzed using the iTree Eco model. The iTree Eco is designed to use a standardized field data with local air pollution and meteorological data to quantify urban forest structure and its numerous effects. This program is what is actually required by the DEC grant to quantify ecosystem services provided by the urban forest. The iTree ecosystem analysis includes tree characteristics and urban forest structures such as species composition, tree health, canopy area, and so on. Amount of pollution removed by the urban forest and its associated percent air quality improvement throughout the year, total carbon stored and net carbon annually sequestered by the urban forest, structural value of the forest, which we'll talk about just shortly, as well as the value of air pollution removal and carbon storage and sequestration. And finally, the potential impacts of infestations by pests such as Asian longhorn beetle, emerald ash borer, gypsy moth, Dutch elm disease, amongst many others. So first from the analysis is the urban forest tree characteristics, along with a graph of the species composition. The urban forest of Canton, the village of Canton, has 859 trees with a mixed tree cover. The three most common species are sugar maple at about 11%, apple species at about 10%, and white ash at approximately 9%. I'll point out here that white ash make up a fairly large percentage of the urban forest, which is not preferred. The trees being rapidly killed by emerald ash borer, you may hear it referred to as EAB, and I might refer to it later on, or we will. And these dead trees will all need to be dealt with one way or another. We did create an ash plan as an associated section to the CFMP just for this reason. I won't talk too much about it, but we will mention it again a bit later on in the presentation. This graph shows the classes of the urban trees. You can see that there are not as many 3 to 6 inch trees as there are larger classes, so the 6 to 12 and smaller ones. What this shows that there was a lack of tree planting for a little bit, with an uptick in 0 to 3 inch trees, or the newer trees that were planted more recently. This is great, and if trees are planted yearly from now on, the urban forest can grow sustainably with an evident reverse J distribution that allows for continued replacement for the largest size classes. Next, I'll talk about structural and functional values. There are more additional ecosystem values that we don't really have time to go over right now, such as leaf area, oxygen production, and some others that you can read in the forest management plan. So urban forests have a structural value based on the trees themselves. For example, the cost of having to replace a tree with a similar tree of either the same species and size or something very similar to it. They also have functional values, either positive or negative, depending on the functions that the trees perform. Urban trees in Canton have the following structural values, with a total of $1.6 million is how much it would cost to replace all the trees in Canton with similar sized trees. In addition, there's 91,000 roughly of carbon storage that's currently present in the trees. So that's the amount of carbon that's there. In addition, urban trees in Canton have the following annual functional values, which includes about $750 of carbon sequestration, so carbon that they're continuously taking up every year. In addition, avoided stormwater runoff of about $1,140, as well as approximately $400 of air pollution removal. And actually water pollution as well, other kinds of pollution. Here's a graph of the tree species with the highest structural value. You can see follows the tree composition somewhat loosely, but is also reflective of it.
All righty. So now that we have a clearer picture of the urban forest, what it's looking like, let's talk about how the urban forest is planned for, managed, and maintained. Planning of the urban forest is largely accomplished by the tree committee. So the tree committee works to improve the environmental quality of the village through protection of existing trees, planting of new trees, and recommending maintenance for all the trees for the benefit of the community. The tree committee is made up of local citizens appointed by the mayor and village trustees, the village superintendent's an ex officio member of the committee, typically. The mission of the tree committee is to protect and improve the village tree canopy, establish both an annual and long-term community tree plan, communicate to others the importance of trees, implement community tree planting projects. The tree committee, along with the steering committee, started this CFMP project, and also, since we've been working on it, has planned several tree plantings and events. Management and maintenance of the urban forest is accomplished by the DPW. So while the tree committee works to plan the urban forest, management and maintenance really of the public trees, including pruning and removals, is carried out by the Department of Public Works. The superintendent of public works may be authorized by the board of trustees to cut down and remove or trim and prune any trees in the street or public place if the board determines that such trimming or removing is in the public interest. So these would be the trees adjacent to the street or right of way. And the village DPW also controls and specifies all tree planting on public property. So with the help from the tree committee and all the volunteers who play a huge role in grassroots efforts as well. Okay, so now we have a picture of what the urban forest looks like. We quantified the ecosystem services from iTree. We know who does what with the forest. Now we can look at what can be done to improve the urban forest and its planning, management, and maintenance. I'll begin now with some urban forest recommendations, starting with urban tree planting or reforestation. So urban forests provide a diverse assortment of benefits ranging from environmental and ecological to social and economic. Talked about that a bit with the iTree info. While maintaining existing trees for long-term sustainability can help protect the sources of these benefits, replanting and establishing new trees is an important factor as well. There's 5 big goals that we've outlined for tree planting. And I guess at this point, I'd like to just let you know too, that there's a ton of detail that we can't really get into now, just mainly because of time constraints, but have a read in the CFMP. and you can get into lots of different information. But here are the goals. Number one, plan to grow the urban forest and plant 20 trees each year in order to increase the urban tree canopy. There's definitely been a concerted effort to plant trees in the village of Canton. However, there's been no actual planting goal set. Adding a consistent number of trees to the urban forest each year can keeps the tree canopy growing in size, increasing the benefits from the urban forest. So this addition of trees will be useful in offsetting tree losses due to inclement weather, diseases and pests, and really for building up the forest. Number two, prioritize planting trees in areas of the village that have low canopy coverage and low tree density. Basically using the inventory, gaps in tree coverage were noted in the CFMP, the management plan, and streets and areas in the village are discussed for planting. Also, areas with available planting sites can be prioritized to make planting more feasible. So if there's already a tree pit vacant or a tree lawn, tree strip, that sort of things, that can become a priority planting area as well. Number three, add to the diversity of the urban forest tree composition. And plant a number of different genera and species of trees so that the urban forest remains resilient to pests and pathogens as they spread, as they become newly established. There's a lot of these different diseases going around and some upcoming ones as well. But diversity of the urban forest is critical to the forest health and is kind of an insurance in order to deal with future pests and disease outbreaks, adverse weather, and so on. And particularly with continuously expanding pest pressure, this goal is going to become more and more important. So really planting various types of trees with varying size, even at maturity, different species types, deciduous versus evergreen trees, small or large, will diversify the urban forest structure and enhance the quality of both the habitat value and aesthetics. Number four, avoid the planting of undesirable or invasive tree species and varieties. Do not plant trees that have been proven to be undesirable really in the urban forest. So certain trees are considered invasive, others may just not be appropriate. They might do poorly in urbanized environments. Other trees might have qualities and traits that aren't preferred in an urban forest as well, such as messy fruit, drippy sap, or even some strange odors from certain trees. And number five, plant appropriate trees in appropriate places. Using proper species selection for the planting zone and site, prioritizing native species, and avoiding infrastructure and wire conflicts. So just like certain trees you don't want to plant, certain qualities in certain trees might make them more appropriate for planting spots. You also might have a tree that might not be a great candidate for a park setting, but might work great as a street tree, for example, and vice versa. Certain trees might never become appropriate because they're not really just a winter hardy tree in Canton, or they can't survive certain urban conditions. Like I mentioned, and tree qualities to consider are tree size and stature. If there's something above it, like a wire, for example, the tree's growth habit, whether it has fruit and seed production, that sort of stuff. And the quality of planting places, as I mentioned, is important for tree health. And certain spots may be more difficult to grow trees. So you definitely plant a proven variety if it's going to be a tricky planting space, or really just avoid that place completely if it's got too many challenges. The complexity required to manage for this array of challenges, especially with budget constraints and everything else going on, makes it even more important to plant the right tree in the right place to really maximize the benefits provided by each tree and build a more resilient urban forest. I could keep going on. There's a ton of more information in the CFMP basically. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but largely we're moving past. Oh, and I did also want to mention in this planting section that we did a couple of planting plans for 2 high priority planting areas in the village. These areas were noted by the tree committee as high priority areas in previous planning processes, but we did a planting plan for a planting in Bend of the River Park, as well as a planting plan for the Route 11 Eastern Gateway.
Next, for urban forestry recommendations are our recommendations for pruning and removal of trees. So we utilized old trees from the previously accomplished inventory that I mentioned earlier that had an overall health rating of less than or equal to 3, which would be fair to poor health or condition. And these were assessed for risk. These trees were identified, GPS located, and then assessed for several factors, such as the location of the tree, whether or not the GPS location of the street and park location, one or the other, its species, the diameter and breast height, which is a standard forestry measurement of the size of the tree, the amount of crown dieback, and the condition of the crown, as well as the condition of the trunk, the root and the root collar, the maintenance task appropriate to that particular tree, as well as a recommendation priority of that tree maintenance timing, as well as any additional notes or comments that we might have had. So using the risk tree inventory, several factors can be noted. The maintenance recommendations priority is probably the most important factor to note for your use. Trees that are a none or low risk priority are healthy trees that have no real immediate need for any maintenance unless otherwise noted. Trees that are a routine or a moderate risk are trees that show minor signs of decline, wounds, or disease, and should be pruned or monitored in future inventory work. So they're not a high priority by any means. Trees that are an immediate priority or high risk tree are trees that show moderate signs of decline that are in need of maintenance, pruning, or removal in order to reduce the current risk. Trees that are a critical concern due to public safety are recommended for prompt maintenance, whether removal or pruning, because they are a public safety concern. So we found that there are 10 removals in the critical concern category, no prunes. A prune would involve basically trimming a large part of the tree that may cause an issue. For the immediate priority or higher risk tree, 63 removals and 8 prunes or trims, depending on the size or so on. For the routine priority or moderate risk, there were 19 removals and 44 prunes, or for the low priority, low risk, there are 45 prunes that we noted in our inventory. Here's our map of all the trees with their associated risk rating. Green is low risk, which are the trees with no pruning needs or very few pruning needs that can be done at a later time. Blue are trees that need minor pruning, such as crown raising or the correction of a minor branch defect, maybe trimming small branches that don't necessarily pose a major issue by any means. Orange are trees that should be managed as soon as possible, and red are trees that are a critical concern that should probably be handled sooner rather than later, much sooner than the other ones. These are in need of removal to mitigate the risk. With none of those that we located could use any sort of a pruning or anything that would otherwise affect them. A 5-year risk tree management cycle based on the tree risk inventory data was developed to support Canton's vision for preserving the urban forest. The program is designed to reduce risk through prioritization of tree removals and pruning, with critical and immediate removal and pruning activities spread over an initial 3-year period to control the costs associated with it, and routine work for lower risk trees, and just basically just kind of maintenance pruning moved out to the last 2 years of the planning cycle. This is a chart of the 5-year cycle with all the prunings and removals called out. First year costs, as you can see, are fairly large. That should be handled with in-house crews, or maybe potentially applying for additional grants that we may be allowed to afford essentially the work that needs to happen. A lot of these are ash trees and may be done by in-house crews with relatively level amount of involvement. And just to mention also, these costs are kind of potentially on the higher end of what they could be, just to kind of control for any really, inflation or any unforeseen costs, inability to get contractors, et cetera.
Great. And before moving past the urban forestry management recommendations section, I just also wanted to get to a couple other recommendations. First is that we created an ash management plan. So Arden just was chatting a bit about removals and risk trees. A lot of those were ash trees. With the EAB coming through, we're going to have to do something about these. But basically what we found after we went through is that, a lot of the ash, were in okay shape, but many were in decline, many had died. And several were removed or had already fallen. Maybe they were in a park and just were laying there. But luckily, the majority, like I maybe mentioned before, are located on public park grounds, such as the Bend in the River Park. And they're not really planted ornamentally, but they're rather like a wild grown tree on the perimeter of a property. After looking through everything, only one ash in Bend of the River Park was substantial in size, form, and quality to warrant EAB treatment, the Emerald Ash Borer treatment. This should be the only ash really on public land that needs to be preserved as the specimen tree. The only other tree that should be treated for Emerald Ash Borer is the ash on the village green near the Veterans Memorial there. And this private public park is owned by the First Presbyterian Church, and a representative was notified about that ash in particular. And after consulting with foresters and arborists, in addition to LBS and AMRO, the decision was made to treat the ash and conserve that ash as an example of majestic tree as well. We also made some heritage tree recommendations as a section to the community forestry management plan as well. So within the village, there are trees that may be considered heritage trees. Trees that might be particularly old, large, uncommon, or valuable to their aesthetic, botanical, ecological, or historic qualities. Some may be naturally occurring. Most likely they were planted years ago by visionary residents who recognized the importance of trees to the quality of life in the community. Many local heritage trees have been lost through the years due to age, disease, storm damage, construction activities, and removal by property owners. But in order to promote community appreciation and pride of such trees, a definition and an inventory of heritage trees was produced as well. So we define any tree greater than 30 inches of DBH, diameter breast height, that's in good health and structurally sound to be a heritage tree. And what we did is located them and included them in our heritage and legacy tree inventory. So we described their qualities, assessed their condition, and came up with a bit of a list. And over time, additional trees can be added to this inventory by the village, and efforts should be initiated to promote public awareness really of these trees and appreciation and conservation of heritage trees in general. So there were a few larger silver maples, one even up to 48 inches in DBH, very nice sugar maple in the park at Court and Pearl, and a really nice, beautiful red oak as well up on Judson Street. In addition to the urban forestry management recommendations that we just discussed, there's also some other sort of administrative other recommendations to talk about. The Village of Canton's been making strides to develop its urban tree and forest management program, but the following slides describe some additional recommendations to further improve and enhance management in relation to the community forest. The first recommendation here is to update the tree code or ordinance for the village. The Village of Canton has a very basic street and park tree code. It's called Chapter 302 Trees. It only covers some elements of maintenance and removal of trees on the public property, in the right of way. This code could be improved upon and expanded upon greatly, and to modernize code and extend the protection of the trees in the village. A more robust tree ordinance is recommended, which is code. And here are our recommended updates. First, create a clear purpose statement and define the terms that are going to be used in the code so that the intention of the code is understood, that there's no confusion, misunderstanding, and interpretation of the code. Next, you should designate municipal authority to administer the ordinance and define the roles of those responsible for management and maintenance of urban trees. For example, the superintendent of public works may be authorized by the board of trustees to accomplish this work. Next, create planting requirements. Currently, there's really no code currently there is code for maintenance or removal, but there is no code that clarifies responsibilities for planting and planting specifications. So spacing of trees, location of trees, recommendations of species to plant, etc. Next, create standards and specifications for really planting, pruning, and removals. There wasn't really a specifications section, so I think adding that would eliminate a lot of uncertainty about what can happen. And then lastly, create a tree protection ordinance update to the code. So this is a bit of a change. To further protection of trees within the village on private property, a tree protection ordinance is recommended. And it's used to protect trees during construction and those of historic or heritage sentimental value. And sometimes this type of ordinance can create conflicts if any of the trees pose safety hazard as well, and it helps to plan for this possibility. But you've probably heard of it in a bunch of different other municipalities. Basically, it's a code that protects trees so that they can't be taken out during development.
So in addition, one of the recommendations that we make is to train a staff member to have credentials as an arborist, certified arborist, presumably as the main approach via the ISA. Successful stewardship of a thriving urban forest requires in-house expertise of a certified arborist who has a clearly defined responsibility at the Department of Public Works for overseeing the urban forests. Planning, training and supervision, scheduling, developing additional DPW protocols, and so on. The arborist should lead a DPW crew trained to provide the necessary workforce to improve the Canton trees. And these folks can be some of the same people that do other jobs already in Canton. Training opportunities should be provided to ensure that the arborist stays current regarding best management practices of the urban forest and other green infrastructure. And the arborist should coordinate tree planting and tree care performed by the staff of the DPW, by consultants or contractors. Having an in-house arborist or knowledgeable plant tree person on board will greatly improve the capacity to create and maintain the urban forest. One other recommendation is to update the tree inventory and maintain an up-to-date database. We noted that there were some errors on the current inventory and found that it wasn't updated properly as the trees have been removed, planted, or just fell down, depending on the case. Because it's almost 5 years old, we also strongly recommend that you complete a full replacement inventory by 2023, potentially by applying to another DEC grant. You should develop a process for regularly sharing information between the DPW, Department of Parks and Rec, Tree Committee, and any other NGO or any other interested groups regarding plantings, removals, trends in tree conditions, and so on. You should charge the Tree Committee with developing a process to be approved by the village arborist that will use the public or coordinated citizen volunteers to help gather and share information between the DPW on tree status, removals, and addressing any of these other trends. You should undertake periodic sample inventories beginning no later than 5 years from the adoption of this plan, focused on a particular planning issue or concern, and this should potentially begin as soon as next year, as I mentioned earlier. Another recommendation is to find and leverage resources and funds for urban forest improvement, which does mean applying to the next round of DC funding for a grant to fund tree planting. With the knowledge that the benefits from trees far outweigh the costs, you should mobilize financial and human resources, public and private, to preserve and expand your urban forests. You should also leverage village funds whenever possible by applying for grants that require a match. So the DEC and the Arbor Day Foundation are two possible scenarios for matching grant opportunities. In addition, you can research and apply for other federal, state, foundational, or other stewardship grants. Another recommendation is to promote community and grassroots efforts, which means engaging the public in the care and stewardship of the urban forest, build public-private partnerships to achieve the village's goals, raising awareness through education, collaboration, and the exchange of information among the stakeholders about the value and needs of the forest as well as the community. Engage with the village's property owners, local businesses, developers, and design community to promote the goals for the urban forest. as well as educate the public about the rationale behind project goals and objectives, best management practices, tree planting, and any other events that might need to be undertaken. You should also bring focus to village tree plantings by bundling them into campaigns that will attract the public's interest. This would generate energy and interest by announcing planting or greeting campaigns and invite public participation. We didn't add this to say that the village isn't doing this already, but rather to show our support of things headed in the right direction and just promoting more of that as well. And that concludes the presentation of the risk tree inventory and the community forest management plan. To summarize, we want to understand the urban forest ecosystem values and build from the current levels of the information that we have. We want to plant trees, maintain current trees, and reduce their risk to the general public. We also provided other urban forest recommendations, such as the tree ordinance updates, as well as others that we mentioned. You should leverage resources and galvanize community support. With that, I'd like to say thank you and ask if you have any questions.
Questions?
Could I, this is Tony Bean. Could I ask a question, please?
Sure, go ahead.
On or around page 22, you were talking about high risk and intermediate risk and low risk trees. And under intermediate concern trees, you talked about that as usually being considered routine pruning. And you had 19 trees in that category that you said should be removed. And I guess that makes me scratch my head. If they're in a category that typically requires routine pruning, how come you're taking out 19 of like 66 trees? That would make me think that they should be in a higher category, either a higher risk, or it just doesn't make sense when the category says routine pruning and you want to remove them. That's kind of opposite.
I think I may have an idea of what's going on with that, Tony, and it would be routine, but it's also sort of a lower risk category. And we did a lot of risk analysis on ash trees. EAV hasn't really run through the village that hard. So I think several of those trees are probably ash trees that don't show major defect, or they're not dead yet and falling apart. But the realistic, maintenance recommendation for them is going to be removal, even though they're currently safe enough.
In addition, there may be trees that are currently in decline, but are not a risk to the general public, or just whether or not due to their species, location, or just generally just how they're structurally sound, yet they're clearly kind of on their way out, so to speak. It's not an immediate risk priority, but it is certainly something that you should address when the tree fully dies, things of that nature.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions from the group?
Richard, okay, go ahead, Herb.
Richard, go ahead.
My question.
Okay, you mentioned of all the ash trees that were at Bend in the River Park, there was one that you felt qualified for treatment and conservation as a specimen tree. Is that particular tree indicated in the inventory? How do we know which? There's a half a dozen or so ash trees there. How do we know which one is the one that you guys selected as the one worthy of being conserved?
That's a good question that I might not have a great answer for, unfortunately. We, in the original course of action on everything, really only slated that one on the village green to be preserved. Not long ago, maybe a few weeks ago, I forget who reached out, Herb, maybe it was you, but it sounded like the tree committee had wanted to preserve another tree in the park over there as well. And, I have no opposition to that. I feel like it's a good, honorable thing to do. And, there were a few trees there that seemed like they would be reasonable candidates to preserve. So I said, go ahead. I feel like that's a good idea as well, but I never did hear back as to whether a tree was chosen or anything really else there. So we knew that that was the intention, but I did not choose a particular tree for that from in the park there to treat.
Yeah, there were quite a few in a little grove, kind of near the river, near some picnic benches, and just kind of not in the center of the park, obviously, but kind of off to the river side of it, that looked like they were in pretty decent shape. So any one of the biggest trees there.
Yeah,
could
they weren't
probably be-
huge, but maybe a 12 or 16-inch tree, something like that.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. Herb, you had a question?
Yes. Thank you for the presentation, and there's a lot of information. I don't know how you covered it so quickly, but one thing on the chart that I was wanting to just make a comment and ask you to confirm, and it's similar to Tony's about the tree removal and the cost. The bottom line with most projects is how much it's costing, but if you look on page 42 with the year 2022, I am noticing the critical ones at $37,000 something, and then the additional pruning. So the total for that year is $47,000. Is that a really inflated number, or is that fairly solid?
That's a realistic number if it was shopped out completely to a contractor.
Also on a 1-by-1 basis too. So
Right.
we didn't really, so that amount of so if you hired a contractor to do one tree of like an ash tree that's in decline, currently there may be no actual danger in terms of the tree, but oftentimes there is. And whenever a tree becomes dead and dangerous, there's actually, it actually costs more to do it, first of all, because you have to cut it smaller and you have to do things more carefully. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is also that it's also per single tree. So I wasn't sure if you would be able to shop out, removing 500 trees, for example, or whatever the number was there. And the bigger the amount of work that you have lined up for a contractor, the lower rate per tree that you would get. So that number is kind of a total of possibly trying to do each tree individually. So it's not necessarily the most fair representation for what if you were to put it out as a bid on, for your local contractors or for any other tree service that may be functioning in your area. But it is something that's realistic on a per tree basis, I guess, and it's just an addition at the end of it. We're not really, capable of bringing the bid value back to you. That's the bid process works in a way that, people just try to get the lowest number for the job on site. So it's hard to say, but that's not an unrealistic, but on the high end of bids. Let's put it that way.
And we did note that a lot of the ash most likely could be handled in-house. For example, there was, doing one ash downtown might cost the same as doing 10 ash in Bend of the River Park that are on the corner, not near anything. So there's a lot going into it, but largely we didn't want to give you a really lowballed number. These things actually do cost a decent amount of money. But you can drive that cost down by bidding out blocks of trees for maintenance, doing it in-house. And yeah, really there's just an associated cost. And I know that there was some work recently done on the Village Green, and I don't know exactly what the costs were there and how many trees were worked up, but I don't think that was a very small cost or project either, but I don't think it was nearly as many trees. So
Right. So we didn't base it off of any historical data for the village, but we did base it off historical value for what it generally costs to, remove a tree, both through experience and just actual numbers that I have for some of these.
So just a follow-up question and comment. Appreciate your candid response and a realistic, hopefully, of what the cost, but that's only for the pruning and taking care of what we had. So you're also recommending 20 new trees, which is probably not going to replace the ones that you'd be taking out. So I wanted to have you comment on page 16 and again on page 76. The village superintendent can be authorized to enter into a written agreement with owners of private property, and that's the right to plant trees within the 10-foot section, which I think is already code. And this allows for tree planting in areas that would not otherwise be possible otherwise. So my question is, I know that you travel around the state a lot and you deal with other communities. And if you have some prior experience with what other communities are doing in this regard, whether they have these written agreements, if you could, not to change anything in your report, but to send us something that might be helpful for a protocol, something might be boilerplate that would help the superintendent do this so we don't have to contact the village attorney and start from scratch. That's something that you're familiar with? Sounds like there's something that might be feasible for a community like Canton. That we be able to do something like that.
It seemed like an interesting and somewhat unique situation that Canton works with private landowners to plant on private property. I haven't seen too much of that before, but I do like that the capacity to do that exists. And I feel that for the Route 11 gateway planting, that it might become a better planting if it is achieved on private property rather than right up against the road. I think it would be a little bit more feasible that way. But in terms of reaching out to every single person along that strip to get permission, even by word of mouth might be difficult. So, writing up an MOU or whatever it may be for each person, I think is just going to be a little bit of a tricky task to accomplish. But it is one that, if willing, that the village can certainly tackle.
And I should add, just to your request for kind of like a boilerplate thing, for better or for worse, all the communities are fairly different. And like Miguel said, there's very few communities that I've encountered that have this, this aspect of the program, of the tree program in the village, where there's a public-private relationship to this extent. So it's actually, it does exist out there. I've actually read through quite a few tree ordinances, but it would be difficult to incorporate something like from, like, say, the city of Portland in Oregon to the village of Canton that would be effective and provide the right thing for you guys. So I will say that I can send those things because I do have, I believe I have some examples of it. So I can send it to you, but it might not be all that useful as I'm getting it.
Well, one of the reasons that we bring up this issue is many of the planting sites that you presented were close to the roadways, actually between the sidewalk and the roadways. And it doesn't really, there wasn't really much appetite from the people that we were discussing this to plant trees in those locations. It would be like 3 feet from the roadway. So the thought was that maybe just to set that planting back 10 feet, which would necessitate private land ownership. And also they would take some responsibility for planting, care, and maintenance, and cut down on some of these costs of tree planting. If we might entertain that kind of principle.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that, I designed and drew up that plan, and I recommend again, that on the other side almost of the sidewalk would be an improved spot as compared to the right of way right there. For a bunch of different reasons, for setback, for salt, and for a whole bunch of different reasons. It just becomes a lot more complex when you're needing to talk to every single landowner there, and maybe you get a couple that really are in, and then a couple that don't even ever call you back, and you can't even get communication through. So I would certainly recommend working on that project, but what I would also note is that the sort of in the village, it's, you know, downtown village, there's really no lack of planting spaces that couldn't, you know, there's a lot of opportunity basically for more planting in other areas of the village. Your stocking is not at all complete. So there's a lot of open tree planting spots, tree strips all up and down, whole entire roads are completely open. So there's, you know, I don't think you're going to have an issue finding easily planted trees in easily planted spaces. But for that other project on the Gateway area, I just feel like that the nature of the beast there is that it's going to be a little bit more complex.
Part of the issue with planting on village-owned places between the sidewalk and the street is the superintendent mentioned the other day at one of our meetings that he would prefer if things weren't planted there in that strip between the sidewalk and the street, and that immediately removes some of the lower hanging fruit as far as for planting sites, because then it puts you generally on the other side of the sidewalk, which is generally privately owned property. And it would be nice to be able to plant trees not continuously in the parks, because at some point they're going to be filled up, and it doesn't really meet our mission if we're only planting in the parks. We're missing a whole big section of the community. You had mentioned hiring an arborist. You know, as a community of 5,000-6,000 people, are there other communities around the state that have an arborist on staff, either in their public works or in some other capacity for the village or the town? Is this something that's really doable, or is this something that's really stretching it where we'd have to find someone on public works and say, we'll pay for you to go get the training? But then if we get the training, are they going to take off and go off on their own because, you know, there's a demand for the certified arborists around? You know, what do you think about that in a community of our size?
I know that there's smaller communities that do have, maybe you wouldn't have them with an ISA certified arborist, some do, but I mean, someone that has tree and plant knowledge at the very least, I think would be a person that would be valuable to hire in that respect or train up. And maybe there's someone that sort of fits that bill that could be trained up and become an arborist, or, you know, trained toward that sort of a thing. So I think training is going to be critical. And I think having someone that can sort of act as an arborist, even if they're not certified as an arborist, that understands trees and can tell them difference between different trees and things like that would be extremely valuable. I don't think that you need to hire like a salaried, you know, arborist for $80,000 a year, but maybe train up someone for whatever it costs to take the ISA arborist test and spend a little bit of, you know, if you spend a little bit, you might be able to kind of capitalize on that factor.
Right. Another thing that we spoke about is basically not necessarily hiring an arborist or, you know, besides just training somebody within the organization or within the Department of Public Works or, you know, anywhere, is actually hiring a consultant that may be responsible. And this might be just basically kind of like a, you know, like 5 hours a week kind of a thing where they go through, but they have to do it at a fairly, you know, rigorous basis, you know, every other week or something like that. I'm just throwing out random time commitments, but basically having a consultant that is responsible for the village's trees. I think we might have even spoken about this during one of the other meetings potentially, and maybe, you know, I'm not sure what other communities in your area like Potsdam, right, are doing. Maybe working with them to see if you can maybe hire somebody to kind of split the difference, even on a part-time basis between the two communities.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions for the,
I have a couple of questions
Go ahead.
and comments. My name is Matilda Larson. I'm a former Canton Tree Committee member.
Oh, can you speak up,
Here, why
Matilda?
don't you come sit by the microphone?
Sit up here.
Sit by the owl.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Matilda Larson. I'm a former Canton Tree Committee member. I'm a resident on Judson Street and I work in the county planning office as a planner. And I wanted to thank everybody for all your hard work on working on this and recognize the time and effort that went into making the document. I did go through it and I would like to offer some friendly suggestions and had some questions that could probably lead to a little more digging in terms of what resources might be available for implementation. Because I think that's a really important component on developing a plan is what resources are available to actually make it happen. Otherwise, it'll get adopted and nothing will come of it because we may not have the resources necessary to do it. One of the comments that I had about the recommended removal policy is that I think it's really important that replacement trees be put in for every tree that does get removed. Otherwise, it's exactly as Herb had mentioned. If we were to actually implement the matrix and remove 63 trees, but only plant 20, we are already operating at a deficit. So I think it's really important to institute a policy of no net loss. Otherwise, we'll continue to see a degradation in the urban tree canopy. And it's really important that we try to maintain that canopy because the urban heat island effect. I'm sure in some portions of Canton today, you're going to feel that when it's 87, 89 degrees. I like the idea of pursuing a hard and challenging gateway project. I think instituting a tree planting on Governor Street is very important. It probably happens to have some of the lower value property values in the village. And you don't want to just see trees in neighborhoods where you have higher housing values because that creates inequity. So even though it's hard and challenging, it's worthwhile and it's important. So I don't think we should dismiss that. The other suggestion that I have is when it comes to leveraging resources for implementation, I didn't know whether or not you knew if National Grid continues to have a cost sharing program for their street trees. And that is a possible resource that might be available. And I think that should be included in the plan. Other resources that I think might be useful for implementation is that I know Soil and Water Conservation District has what's called Part C monies. It's an annual state funding allocation where they work with local municipalities. And since Canton does have a forest management plan that's about to be adopted, it may elevate and raise your profile as a successful partner, especially when Aaron was involved, I think, with the tree planting at the park. So you've demonstrated some success that way, and I think that's a really good resource to have. Some other suggested resources that I don't know much about is, I think it does make more sense to hire a consultant for services rather than counting on an employee to do it, because everybody here is already doing so much. And it may make sense to see if you can use grant funds to help cover those consultation costs, whether it be LWRP monies or Blue Way monies. What about, are funds available through the DEC to assist with the creation of a tree ordinance? You know, those were some suggestions. So I thought it was really good that you did the assessment and that you came up with a matrix, but I think it fell a little bit short on what resources are available to actually implement the plan, because I think that's going to be really important in order to convince the village that it's worth investing in. Those would be my friendly suggestions.
Thank you. Anyone else here?
Yeah, so in this presentation, we talked a lot about tree risk and also tree planting and right tree, right place. One thing that I want to also stress to the village is routine maintenance. Routine maintenance is much cheaper than removing risk trees, and it makes you pay attention to what's going on. I think that's super important to realize for the village. Just as much as planning and planting and removing is the maintenance. Just like with people with life, you maintain, you're gonna live longer, happier life. If you don't, you're not gonna be as happy and you're not gonna live as long. So I just wanted to let you all know that.
Thank you.
Very true.
I should also mention that if, if you had a little bit of a sticker shock, the majority of the cost that we essentially suggested could be potential cost is actually the trees that weren't maintained. So to kind of follow up on Steve's note there is essentially, if you, the best time to correct any problem with a tree is when it's small. The bigger it gets, the more problems it gets, and the less likely any intervention you're going to have is going to be successful. So the sooner you start correcting those problems, the quicker it's going to go and the cheaper it's going to go as well.
Thank you. Anyone else here on the board? Questions? Thoughts?
It's been an engaging conversation and I've learned a lot. So I appreciate the education and the questions that have been asked. I think we have a lot to think about as we move forward. So thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone else on the tree committee out there? Okay.
I'd like
think we're
to
done.
just point out, we have some precedent about regarding the planting on private property versus in that narrow strip that was discussed several times tonight. Now, I wasn't living in Canton during the 98 ice storm that hit the North Country, but there were massive tree losses over hundreds of square miles. And my understanding is the state of New York actually provided trees to villages like Canton, and they were essentially given to private landowners, and the village planted them on people's front lawns. The home I live in, I believe, has two shade trees on the front lawn that were provided by the state and planted by the village. And I know others in Canton who were here in 98 when that happened. So I don't think it's necessarily a major obstacle to work with the private landowners to approach the street tree plantings that way. It actually integrates with some of the other things that were talked about tonight relative to developing community spirit and interacting more with village residents, so that you decide on a neighborhood that's a priority neighborhood for new street plantings, and give people the opportunity to say, yeah, we would love a tree on our lawn 10 feet back from the sidewalk. And yeah, the tree you've selected would be good. We'd welcome that. And sure, there's going to be some people that say they don't want it, but better to have that interplay and decide who's going to go along with it and who's not, rather than just planting trees by the village in that little narrow strip that becomes a maintenance nightmare. And local residents may not want that anyway. So this interplay between private landowners and the village, I think, is very important in all kinds of ways, but particularly in the new street tree plantings. It would also give you, if you're able to move the tree back 10 feet, it expands your opportunity for what kind of tree you can plant. If you got 3 foot wide strip to plant, you're narrowed down to a list of about a half a dozen trees. And nobody wants to be walking down the sidewalk and have branches in their face and so on. So I wouldn't dismiss that as difficult. I think it in a large extent is the way to go and has multiple benefits.
Right. I've seen it in a couple of communities where there's a request form. Generally, it's for the the utility strip area. But if you have the option for, for private plantings as well, then you could actually work through a process like that where you would have the customers request, or not the customers, but the residents request it so that you can get it to the people that care about it, and we'll take care of them.
Hey, thank you. Anyone else? We good? Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for coming. Okay,
Awesome.
I think that includes our presentation, our special meeting. We're in for an informational meeting.
Thank you.
So thanks for coming.
Thank
everybody.
you.
Good night, everybody.
Yep, good night.
Hey,
Hey, guys.
you need this?